Odisha produces over 24 million tons of crude steel annually, roughly one-fifth of India's total output. It is the industrial engine driving the nation's infrastructure. This map shows the Angul district. Because of its massive reserves of coal and iron ore, it has become a primary hub for this intensive production. Within this district, massive integrated megaplants and dozens of small-scale sponge iron units operate side by side. These facilities draw from the same mineral reserves and are governed by the same state-level regulators, yet their environmental performance is sharply divided. This divergence suggests that environmental accountability in the steel sector may depend less on regional oversight and more on the physical scale of the operations themselves. On paper, the legal baseline is consistent. All facilities must comply with the Environment Protection Act, along with specific standards for air and water pollution. In practice, regulatory requirements scale with size. Large plants are mandated to maintain continuous emission monitoring, while small units often operate just above the minimum thresholds for oversight. This aerial view shows a large-scale industrial complex. Policymakers usually view these megafactories as the primary regulatory threat because of their sheer volume of production. However, while the integrated plants have the resources for complex mitigation, the smaller, undergoverned units often bypass these systems entirely, creating a localized pollution load that persists despite their smaller industrial footprint. This raises a critical question about whether enforcement resources are being misallocated by focusing on total volume rather than the intensity of emissions at smaller sites. This bar chart compares PM10 levels across steel plants. PM10 causes direct respiratory damage. The dashed line is the legal limit, 100 micrograms per cubic meter. Large plants average 120. But small-scale units average 240 micrograms, more than double the threshold. Smaller plants often lack capital for modern pollution control, like electrostatic precipitators. Without this technology, they cannot effectively scrub particulate matter from their exhaust. Per unit of output, these smaller operations serve as high-risk pollution hotspots, releasing a significantly higher share of particulates into the local air. Effective regulation relies on accurate measurement. Without data, oversight is impossible. This chart displays the installation rates of continuous emission monitoring systems, or CEMS, across different plant sizes. Adoption rates plummet as the facilities get smaller. While over half of large plants have automated tracking, that figure drops to just 15.8% for small-scale units. This gap highlights a failure in operational governance. The internal structures, like environmental management systems and dedicated safety committees, that ensure a plant follows through on legal requirements. The deficit is compounded by a lack of external oversight. Currently, only 15% of small units undergo third-party environmental audits. They rely instead on self-reporting, which is often irregular and owner-centric. Statutory mandates fail when there are no internal mechanisms to bridge the gap between the law on the page and the reality on the ground. To quantify these findings, researchers developed the Composite Environmental Governance Index, or CEG. It aggregates 12 distinct legal and operational indicators into a single score. This index provides an objective metric from 0 to 100, measuring how well a facility manages its environmental impact. Without internal audits and independent directors, the governance structure for small units falls apart. Their average score drops to just 59.3%. This regression scatter plot maps the relationship between physical plant size and its final compliance score. The model shows a clear linear trend. The R-squared value of 0.65 indicates that 65% of a plant's environmental compliance can be explained by its capacity alone. This confirms that physical and economic scale are the primary factors enabling a firm to implement the systems necessary for accountability. The data shows that a plant's physical size is the primary empirical predictor of its environmental accountability. These governance deficits result in direct, localized impacts for the people living near these industrial zones. Health data shows a high concentration of respiratory illnesses and heavy metal contamination within a 2 to 5 kilometer radius of non-compliant small-scale clusters. Local communities often have no clear path for grievance redressal. They are forced to protest against opaque operations, lacking transparent reporting or accessible public records. Regulators, like the State Pollution Control Board, lack the manpower for frequent manual inspections, making them reliant on the very data these smaller plants are failing to collect. The absence of automated monitoring in small units leaves regulators blind, creating a cycle where violations continue without legal consequence. A uniform legal framework is insufficient if it cannot be monitored or enforced at the smaller end of the industrial scale. To control regional pollution, state policy must move beyond passive mandates and begin requiring internal structural transparency from every operator. High-impact requirements, such as real-time monitoring and mandatory third-party audits, must be applied to all facilities, regardless of their economic size. Oversight can no longer be limited to the largest emitters, while the high-intensity pollution from smaller plants goes unaddressed. Sustainable industrialization requires dismantling the small emitter paradox. Accountability must be built into the operational structure of every plant, providing environmental justice for the communities that live in their shadow.